Principle number 3, staging. Staging is arguably the most important thing when it comes to visual storytelling. Staging is how you visually present an idea to the audience. It is what directors, cinematographers, and storyboard artists focus on to make sure the audience's eye is directed into the right place at the right time on screen. In each shot of a movie, the most important part of the story is going to be framed. You can use a literal frame, like a mirror, a door frame, or a window, or you can frame characters with lighting or the other characters in the shot. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how I study staging, I'll go over some camera terminology, and then I'll show you how to set up cameras in Maya. This lesson will especially be useful for anyone interested in layout and previs animation. So good staging is the same as making a good composition. Something I like to do to understand good composition and staging is watch movies with good cinematography, and then do thumbnail sketches of my favorite frames. This helps expand your knowledge for tasteful shots and good composition. Here's a sequence from the movie Grandmaster. This is my favorite movie when it comes to cinematography. It's a kung fu movie, and the director shot this sequence like they were preparing to fight. In these shots, the main character is given a cigarette. For some reason, I love this sequence so much, I had to thumbnail it out and understand why. I learned a lot by doing this. Even with black and white values, you can get a lot out of each shot. When I do these thumbnail sketches, I squint my eyes and I look for the main values of dark and light. That way, I can understand what the director wanted me to look at when he shot it. I'll do a quick sketch of this sequence from Incredibles 2 so you get the idea. Alright, so we start off with the first shot, and it's just an establishing shot. The camera's mid-level. We're at a restaurant. The characters are getting seated. This shot doesn't need to be very fancy or anything. It's mostly just getting all the characters in there and setting up the environment that they're in. The main characters are framed by some crowd characters, and you can tell that the lighting on them is a little darker, so then they stand out in the middle. Also, they're framed by a nice bunch of plants. Now the second shot, we're from Violet's perspective, the daughter. She's in the foreground. We see the back of her head here, and we're looking at her dad. Her dad is happy. Happy. And it looks like he's talking to her. This we establish the foreground with the children, and middle ground, which is the dad, and there's some background elements like a light and some more characters back here, and we get a little bit of the ceiling to see what perspective we're at. The third shot is when the waiter comes up that she has a crush on, and she gets surprised and water shoots out of her nose. So this shot is actually almost from a perspective of someone else, like a spectator from a different table, which I think is hilarious if you saw this in a restaurant. So it makes a really interesting shot. We get all the characters in there, and we focus on Violet shooting the water out of her nose. We get the brother looking at her disgusted, and there's some darkness on the left side of the screen with the lighting, and a little bit on the right on the waiter, and he's framing her with a pitcher of water and a cup. I chose this sequence because I really found it amazing how they have this reverse shot right after, and it's from the brother's perspective if you really think about it, but it's just great because she's turned around now, trying to hide herself. But that gives us a great view of the rest of the characters on the screen. So she's hiding, really embarrassed. She's like, I'm fine. And then we get all the characters looking at her, which keeps our focus on her, but gives us the opportunity to see what the other characters are doing. The dad's looking a little bit more concerned. He takes up a lot of the screen, but he's still not as in focus as Violet is. It's such a funny moment that I think the next shot maybe just gives us more time to enjoy and laugh in the moment. It's from the waiter's perspective now, a little higher up than the waiter, but it's still from his perspective, and we get the dad mostly in frame with this really cheeky smile. We're pretty much focused solely on the dad because we can barely even see Violet in this shot. She's so tiny and dark in the shot. And the little brother, you can see his reaction now, just a little bit. He's happy. So this shot is mostly about seeing how the dad is reacting to such an embarrassing situation. He just keeps talking to the waiter like nothing's happening. And then the last shot, it's really low angle. It's right on the table. It's not from anyone's particular point of view. It's more of like an omniscient point of view. We get a good foreground element with the brother. And then we have Violet here, which is the main focus. She's the main focus because you can see that everyone is looking at her. The dad's eyes, his eyes, just like in this shot. The shot's really nice because then we get all the characters in the frame. The dad's happy. When I do these, I try to consider what the characters are feeling, where they're looking, what they're thinking. It's almost like reverse storyboarding. You're trying to break down and see what the director was thinking when he was making these shots. So that's a really rough version of doing thumbnail sketches for a movie sequence. You can go in there and get really fancy with blocking out all the lighting and fully rendering it. But even doing quick sketches like this, I get a lot out of understanding how to create a good looking shot. Another way to improve and practice staging is to take pictures or videos with your phone or a good camera. Even when I'm just taking a picture with my phone, I try to be conscious of what's inside of my frame. Things I try to look for is a good contrast between light and dark. I look to keep foreground, middle ground, and background elements clearly separated, and I try to keep the interesting part of the image on a third or in the center of the image. You should also know about camera moves, what they are, and how they are different. A pan is when the camera rotates with its position locked, usually on a tripod. A tilt is the same, but up and down. A Dutch angle is rotation, but on the z-axis. A zoom is just moving the focal length. A dolly is moving the camera forward or backwards. A truck is moving the camera horizontally. And a pedestal is moving the camera vertically. Typically, you can get away with saying just pan when you want to rotate the camera and move when the camera moves positionally. Most people will understand what you mean. You just don't want to say pan if the camera is actually moving, or zoom if the camera is on a dolly. This might sound kind of goofy, but if you're trying to communicate with other artists about a camera move you or they want to create, you can put your hand in this gesture and aim it like the camera viewing angle. It's surprisingly effective, especially if someone forgets camera terminology like pan or dolly or zoom. Now let's open Lesson 3's Maya file and fix 5 examples of poor staging. Alright, now that you have Lesson 3's Maya file open, let's take a look and find these 5 bad cameras we gotta fix. So in the outliner, we have these 5 camera groups. They contain geo and camera. Let's take a look at the first camera. So this shot, it looks like 2 characters are talking, and the camera is way up here. Let's set the layout better so we can work on the camera on one side of the viewport and work in the perspective on the other side. Go to Panels, Layouts, 2 panes side by side. Let's make this one camera 1, and this one can be perspective. The shader's kind of broken. You can just click on this to fix that. What I like to do with my camera is click on this box. It creates a film gate so I know what's inside of the camera view. But sometimes it gets cut off. So go to View, Camera Settings, and make it horizontal. Cool. To select cameras, you can either go in the outliner and select it, or you can click on this box here to select it. So we want to have a better idea of where this camera is in space. You can turn on its frustum. This is like its viewing angle. So click on the camera, go to your attribute editor. If your attribute editor isn't on the side here, you can go to Windows, General Editors, and then Attribute Editor. Go to Frustum Display Controls and click on Display Frustum. This is really helpful for me. And then if you notice in this camera, there's like some weird artifacts on the geometry. You can fix that by making the near clipping plane to 1 and adding more zeros to the far clipping plane. Now the characters are a little bit more smooth. We can maybe even make that more, 2. Okay. You can move cameras around just like you would a viewport by moving it like this. And if you want to undo the camera move you just did, you have to click on your keyboard and hit the brackets, left bracket to undo and right bracket to redo. Alright, so if this shot, the two characters are talking, this camera feels way too high to understand what they would be talking about. We want to be able to see their expressions and how they're acting, so if you were having a conversation with someone, you'd rather be looking right at them. So let's move this camera way down. And maybe it's from this perspective of the soldier. So we want to frame things kind of nicely. I like to click on these icons to make sure the important parts of the character aren't going off to the edge of the screen. I want to make this shot a little bit more flat so we can see the character clearer while still being an over the shoulder shot. Let's change the focal length to 70 and then bring the camera back a little bit more and adjust it so they're in the frame properly. I think 80 works better. If you didn't tell the difference, you can really change it to something really low, and 20. It'll be a lot more distorted, and then we really can't see the character. So let's flatten it out again, bring it back to 80. Anything that's in a portrait style shot, it'll make the character's face look nicer too because it flattens it out. If the focal length's too small, then the character will start getting distorted and their face will look like a banana. Okay. I think I'm pretty happy with this shot. I'm trying to keep things within the frame. And now we can see what the character's emotions would be when he's talking to the soldier. Let's lock this camera. You can do that by clicking on this icon, and now it won't be edited anymore. So let's hide camera group 1 and then go to camera group 2 and hit H to show it. Then click on panels, perspective, camera 2. View, camera settings, horizontal. So for this camera, it looks like two characters are squaring off for a fight. The problem with this camera is that the characters are getting cut off by the frame, and this guy is a little bit too close to the frame. Also, the camera still looks a little high. You can change how opaque this gray area is by clicking on the camera, going to Attribute Editor, scrolling down to Display Options, and changing the opacity to 1. I also like to change it to black sometimes. Let's click on the action safe border and move the camera back so the characters are properly in frame. There, now we're not cutting off any of the characters. Let's lower the camera now. It's good to have the camera lower because a lot of the time you'll have foreground elements that'll lead your eye to the main characters in the midground. So if we rendered this, you'd see all sorts of cool looking brick or bushes or something like that, and it would lead us to where the characters are going to fight. I want to make this focal length lower too. Last time we made it higher, but let's take the focal length and make it shorter or lower, so that way we can see a little bit more of the front half of the characters. It'll create a little bit more depth. So let's make that 18. Let's move the camera in. You can hit spacebar on this panel and you can view it in full screen. So that camera looks pretty good. Let's lock it and move on to the next one. Hide group 2, show group 3, click on camera 3. You can also middle mouse drag and drop the camera into the viewport to view from it. So this camera looks pretty good, but if you look at the channel box, the camera has some Z rotation on it. You don't want to have any Z rotation on your camera unless it's specifically for a Dutch angle. Even if it looks nice like this and it makes the ground nice and flat, you really want to avoid rotating the camera in Z. It might give the audience an uncomfortable feeling on accident. You can use a Dutch angle if you purposely want to make the audience more uncomfortable, like in a scary movie. So let's take this down to 0. And now we can just edit the camera to make sure the characters are in frame. Cool, now the camera and perspective feel a lot more normal. Let's lock this camera. Hide camera group 3, move on to camera group 4. So this camera looks pretty good to start with. The horizon line is low, the character is in a clear silhouette, but I think we can make it a little bit more interesting and dynamic. Let's change the focal length to be lower. We can change it down to 18 and then move the camera in. Now we have the hammer as a foreground element, and it's bigger in frame. Let's also rotate the camera a little bit this way to stretch out the character and lower it so we get a perspective of it being on the ground. Let's bring it a little closer. Cool, we can see the character's face clearly and the hammer is a lot bigger in frame. Alright, let's lock this camera too. And let's move on to the last camera. So here we have a really heroic shot of Thor. The tree branches are framing Thor, but it seems a little forced, and we'd rather just see a closer image of his pose. I also think it would be really cool if we had a moving camera for this shot, so we get a better view of the pose that Thor's in. So let's set our workspace up so we can have both cameras side by side, the perspective and the camera we're going to work with. Panels, layout, 2 panes side by side. Let's make sure this camera settings is on horizontal. Alright, so a really easy way to make moving cameras is by putting cameras in groups and animating those groups instead of the cameras themselves. So with nothing selected, go to your outliner, click on Ctrl G, it'll create a null. Now go to your camera, left click, and then middle click and drag and drop into the null. That created a camera inside of a group. The null was created at origin. We don't really want that, so let's hit Shift P to get the camera out of the null. And now let's move the null up into the middle of where Thor is standing. If it's lined up with his torso and head, then we'll have a camera that rotates properly around him. Now let's drop that camera in here. Middle mouse click and drag and drop into the null. Let's make our camera move for about 80 frames. So the thing about moving cameras is most of the time you're going to want to just stick with 2 keyframes, a beginning and an ending position. And most of the time they're going to want to be on linear tangents, so the camera's at a constant speed. You can add a lot more keys to your camera, but most of the time I found that an effective camera is a really simple one. So let's make sure the null is selected, hit S, and let's rotate it over here. That can be our starting position. And then our last position can be over here. Let's go into the graph editor and make sure this is a linear tangent. You don't have to make these linear, but I noticed that if a camera starts off not moving and then picks up speed, it feels like when you cut to that shot, you're not cutting into an action, and it might ruin the pace of the edit. So let's take a look at this shot. So that's working pretty good, but I want to see Thor more. So let's change the focal length to be longer. Click on the camera. Let's change it to 80. So it looks like our character is getting cut off by the film gate. Let's click on our camera and we can have it tilt up a little bit. Let's make sure the character's in the middle. The thing I'm noticing that's wrong with this camera still is that he's being rotated just off of center. In a heroic shot like this, you're going to want to have the character dead center. So we need to change the position of the null. Let's make sure it's rotating around his face. The center line can drop right in between his face and his torso. Okay, great. Now he's perfectly centered in the camera. The last thing I want to do is move the camera a little bit higher up. We can do that with the null. I just don't want it to be going directly through the trees, maybe just the tops of them. So take your Z rotate, so take your X rotate. Let's go to a frame where we see the treetops, and let's just rotate this camera. This is cool because it'll just be rotating the camera from the position of the null. Let's see how that looks. Great, we get a little bit of foreground elements with the trees zooming by, and we focus on the character in a really heroic pose. Animating this without a null would have been a lot harder. To get a camera to do a smooth arc like that would have taken a lot more keyframes and finessing. Since it's in a null, you can animate the camera as well, doing a different motion. Let me show you what I mean. So what if there's lightning coming down from the sky and we want to have it pan down following the lightning through Thor's body? So let's go to our null, set a keyframe on the last frame so we can edit the first one. Go to rotate X and have it starting up higher. And then at the end, it can be a little lower. Let's make these linear. Let's hit play. Cool, let's animate the camera itself. Hit S to set a key, and at the end hit S to set another key. Let's change the rotate X to start up high, and then at the end, it can actually just stay where it was. And then let's make those linear. So setting a few simple keys on a group and a camera, we can animate a really difficult camera move. I hope you guys enjoy this lesson as much as I did. I really personally like animating cameras and finding how you can improve staging and composition. Cameras are kind of hard to understand at first, but after doing tons of practice and experience, you'll learn how to make nice looking ones. Alright, talk to you guys in lesson 4.